Since inception, Israel has taken pride in being an issue that receives bipartisan support in the United States, across the aisle. There's no denying, though, that this is changing. On the surface, the Republican Party might appear aligned with Israel, but under the surface, we're not sure what's happening. And also, while support on the Democratic side might appear to have become fragmented, maybe it's not. Is what appears to be happening the true story? Here to lead our next panel is Herb Kanan, the Jerusalem Post's senior diplomatic analyst.
Hi, thank you for joining us again. The panel now is a panel that's very timely as we come up to the elections in America. It's called the U.S. and Israel Alliance. Is there a future for bipartisan support? Joining me now from the U.S. is Congressman Ted Deutsch from Florida and Liz Schreier, the president of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Thank you for joining us. Congressman, Representative Deutsch, let me start with you. Does Israel still enjoy bipartisan support in the U.S.?
It absolutely does, and it's good to be with you. And I thought the question was a rhetorical question. Of course, there is strong bipartisan support, and I would simply point to the record of this Congress and this Democratic House of Representatives that has overwhelmingly passed resolutions condemning the BDS movement, the pernicious BDS movement. We've moved legislation that takes the Memorandum of Understanding negotiated between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu and puts it into statute for the first time. And we've reaffirmed ironclad support for Israel's security. So there is a strong record of bipartisanship going back to Israel's, the founding of the modern state of Israel, and Harry Truman's recognition of that state, and that continues through today.
Liz, do you agree with that? I mean, do you agree with the assessment that the bipartisan support is still there and is still as strong as it always has been?
Well, first, I'm thrilled to be here and delighted to be here with my friend Ted Deutsch. I absolutely do, but I'm going to give a little bit of a warning. I think there's no question that on the key pillar, when it talks about our strategic relationship, that there's fundamental bipartisanship that goes back, as Ted says, to the founding of Israel. Decades and decades of bipartisan support, Democrat presidents and Republican presidents in Congress, as we've seen, as Ted said, from annual foreign aid packages, from the qualitative commitment to a qualitative military edge, to things that Ted has done where he's led efforts to show almost unanimous support for anti-BDS efforts. And I think if there was a resolution on the Abraham Accord, we'd see that as well. But there are always differences on some very specific issues. And we see that between Republicans and Democrats, between Democrats and Democrats, between the American Jewish community, and between Israel. You see it. Ongoing differences in debates on the Palestinian issues, on settlements. We saw it when George H.W. Bush had differences with Israel on loan guarantees, when President Obama had differences with many on the Iran deal. But here's my warning, and I'm sure we'll get into in the discussion, which is when policy disputes get brought up into manifest in partisan wedge issues. And those wedge issues get manifested when Democrats' beliefs and Republican issues gets translated into that is broader into support for Israel. We have debates in a hyper-partisan moment in America of whether wearing masks is a partisan issue, where you buy blue jeans and which kind of blue jeans you buy. And I grew up at a time where foreign policy was politics literally stopped at the water's edge. That's how I was taught. And Israel really transcended that. And I have great pride, I know Ted does too, that bipartisan support on Israel was always kind of the bedrock. We saw a Democratic leader, Steny Hoyer, and Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader, brought 70 freshmen a year ago to Israel, Democrats and Republicans, and how proud we can be. But it is concerning when some issues get wedged in there in a partisan way, and we need to be careful that that doesn't happen.
Congressman Deutsch, let me take that forward and ask you, what can Israel do, if anything, to keep itself from becoming a wedged issue? I mean, is this something that's dependent on Israeli actions, or is this something that's just simply out of our hands?
Well, I want to first follow follow to what Liz said, and I'll talk about Israel in a minute and what Israel can do, but more broadly, remember when we talk about the values of democracy and human rights and equality, those have always been the bedrock. It's been the bedrock of the relationship, and in these days in America, even those values, democracy, human rights, equality, are often viewed through a partisan lens, which is unfortunate and I think damaging. It's concerning. We can talk more about that. But as it relates to Israel and Israel's actions, there are those who would always prefer to see the United States support for Israel become a political issue. The other is better for the U.S.-Israel relationship when history has shown strong bipartisan support under Democratic and Republican administrations. The key is to not fall prey to that. I think our goal is to provide support for the U.S.-Israel relationship and making sure that it doesn't become a political issue. And Israel obviously is a strong democracy with a wide range of opinions that get hashed out on the floor of the Knesset and in a vibrant press. And one of the things that we have in common, and making sure that in neither country we allow the U.S.-Israel relationship to become partisan, for people to believe that only with one leader in America or in Israel, as opposed to another leader in America or Israel, will the relationship be strong. It's not accurate. It's concerning if some try to espouse those views, and we just have to continue to focus on those shared values that bring us together.
Well, let me take that forward then. Now, I mean, is there? There's a very close relationship now between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Is that something that, in the long term, in your mind, is turning Israel into a political issue, and that can be detrimental for Israel in the long term?
Well, look, I think, and I think we would all agree that a strong U.S.-Israel relationship is good for both of our countries in the long run. And look, I have concerns when the Trump administration. I have concerns when President Trump starts to make suggestions about who's better for Israel and whether Jews are being disloyal to Israel if they don't support a particular political view. First of all, that's nonsense. Secondly, it's by turning Israel and support for Israel into a political issue that we risk changing the nature of that relationship as it's existed for decades. What's good for Israel and for the United States is to continue the long-standing relationship between our two countries. That is not just between any two leaders. I think it's important for the leaders to get along. It's important for the leaders to be able to speak frankly to one another. But it is the strength of the relationship between our countries and between our people that has served both countries so well, and that we have to continue to focus on.
Can I just add something here? We don't want to fall into Israel doesn't want to fall into the partisan trap that Congressman Deutsch just talked about. And it's that mission to Israel that I talked about earlier, when the head of the Democratic Party and the head of the Republican Party take almost 100 members of the freshman class to Israel. But what we want to see, I was the political director at AIPAC almost 30 years ago. And I remember when it wasn't so natural for Republican members running for Congress to come into the halls of AIPAC to want to learn and want to engage with the American Jewish community. And now that would be almost absurd to think of that, because of course Republican members running for Congress want to come and learn and engage about Israel. And the truth is that Congress constantly changes over. Today, if you look at Congress, since 2014, 1/3 of the Senate has changed over. Half of the Congress has changed over. Even on the Republican side, since Donald Trump won, almost half of the Republicans have changed. So it is in our own interest in America to make sure that we're constantly meeting and engaging with members who are running for Congress to learn. So what should Israel do is not fall into the partisan trap. So when Donald Trump, moves the embassy to Israel, moves the embassy to Jerusalem, which is something that we all celebrate, make sure Ted Deutsch is invited to come. That's a good thing. Donald Trump and Joe Biden should want U.S.-Israel relations to be bipartisan. When the UAE flight, which is fantastic, this is something we should all celebrate. Democrats and Republican congressional leaders should be on that flight. I think that's a great thing that would happen. And if it was a Democratic president, Republican legislators should be on. That is what is in Israel's interest, to celebrate bipartisan support.
Well, when you speak about the bipartisan support, look, I mean, there's a lot of concern here, a lot of attention here paid to American support for Israel. And when politicians are looking at the polls, right, they're seeing that, okay, Republican support is rock solid, Democrat support is strong, but there's a certain wing of the Democratic Party which Israel's having some problems with, and that's the progressive wing, with the Squad and whatnot. How concerned are you about their emergence in the Democratic Party and what that will do to the Israel-U.S. relationship?
Well, look, the Democratic caucus, the Democratic House, has been clear with the members that you referred to, has been clear in reaffirming our support for the U.S.-Israel relationship. There are members whose views I disagree with, and obviously in this case, I'm a longtime supporter of a two-state solution. I hope that the normalization of relations between Israel and the UAE might help prod the Palestinians back to the negotiating table when there's an opportunity to do that, so we can work again toward two states. And some of my colleagues now view this differently. Don't support a two-state solution, and I disagree with them. I obviously have enormous disagreements with those who think that it's somehow acceptable to single out Israel for boycott and to advance a movement that is founded upon the premise of a movement that has no place for a Jewish state in the Middle East. So there are differences with my colleagues. They know that. I've had those discussions. I raise the issue and will always stand firm where I believe they or any of my other colleagues are wrong. But the important thing to remember here is that when I'm standing firm in support of the U.S.-Israel relationship, I'm standing firm together with the overwhelming majority of my colleagues who stood with me to condemn BDS, who stood with me to unanimously advance our legislation to build upon and strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship. So it is important for us to acknowledge that for all of the time that we spend focused on a handful of new members in the freshman class, for example, that we also recognize the large number of members of the freshman class who bring to Congress their backgrounds in national security and intelligence, who understand the importance of the relationship and who are quite outspoken in support of that relationship. And they will come back after they're reelected with even more power, with a Democratic caucus and a Democratic president, I believe, who will continue to stand with.
Thank you, Liz. Let me just turn this question to you for a second. What do you think that Israel can do to make inroads in with the progressives?
Right after the 2016 election, I was asked to give a speech to a group of foreign policy leaders from all kinds of different organizations about how do you organize around foreign policy. What I didn't realize is it was sold to me a little differently, that it was a group about progressive foreign policy who were looking to put together a platform. I really sit kind of in the middle of the political spectrum when I organize, and they started talking about their progressive foreign policy platform. It was on climate, endless wars, and one person said, and one of our platforms is going to be the end the Israeli occupation. And I literally walked out because I realized this is not what I signed up for. And I thought about this really hard about, what do we do? And I realized, wait, I need to understand where this is coming from. I totally agree with Ted. I think it's a very, very small group and most of the freshman class is right where Ted talked about. But what I think Israel needs to understand is, a lot of what we need to do in political world where I live is think about who the messengers are and what the message and how do you connect with. One of the issues here is young people and how they connect. I have 2 children who spent 13 years in Jewish day school. They have 8 Israeli cousins, 4 of which who are in the army. And as my youngest son says to me, who's 26 years old, says, "Mom, I am the outlier among my age group. And they are not like you, who you tell me all the time how the David and Goliath stories of your youth, and that you were in a youth tour when in July 4th in 1976 in the raid of Entebbe. That is not the Israel that my contemporaries know." And so one of the things we need to talk about is how do the progressive left of the Democratic Party understand and engage Israel? Who are the messengers? How do they see Bibi Netanyahu, whether our listeners, like him, support him or not, but to understand the perspective where that age group doesn't even see, their understanding connection of the Intifada is a very different way that they don't even see that. They see a very different issue, and we have to engage and understand. So I think there is a messenger, a message, and a method. Pull out your phones and start thinking about how do we engage and break through. And Ted can talk about that from the elected officials and what they understand.
We just have, unfortunately, time for one last question, which I'd like to pose to both of you. And that's, again, there's a lot of talk here about the drift between the American Jewish community and Israel, that there's this gap, this chasm that's starting to open up. And my question is, to what degree does that impact on how politicians view Israel and their support of Israel? Is that an impressive, when they see that the American Jews are perhaps moving away, what does that do to their support? Congressman Deutsch?
Remember, most members of Congress don't come from places like Boca Raton, where I live. They don't have large Jewish communities. They come to this issue as one more important foreign policy issue for them to learn about. And the response for them is the same as the response for the progressives, just to close out that last question. I talk to progressives all the time about the things that we have in common, about ending the war in Yemen, about standing up for human rights, about standing up to autocrats and speaking up for democracy, and helping them understand, whether it's progressive Democrats or whether it's Republicans who are looking at these polls, helping them just understand that our democracy and the range of opinions that we have here is what we have in common with Israel in a region where that otherwise doesn't exist. And when they understand that, and when they hear from people across the political spectrum, then we move beyond just the conflict, which I think is important for us to do. And remember the aspirational vision of Israel, which is what has drawn so many people to work towards strengthening that relationship from the beginning.
Okay, well, on that note, unfortunately, we have to conclude. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for joining us. This is a topic that we can discuss for hours and hours, and hopefully we'll be able to do it at some other point. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.